Hello, Maslux. I've been wanting to make you a video for, I don't know, a week and a half or more. And it's just funny. You come to this point where you're just going to make petulant comments. Let me tell you what I think. Now, I've said in the past that I think these conversations end up in psychological matters, but really a more technical thing to say is that they end up being discussions about the conversation itself and the nature of the conversation. For example, if they come to semantics, it's the nature of the words you use, but the sounds and definitions and concepts. You know, it might come to be evident that you have a concept but use a different sounding word for it, and we can discover that, and then we decide, should we use a new word in common or adjectives on our words to discriminate. We have choices about that. Now, what I think has happened, and the explanation for your petulance goes as follows. I have been arguing against the classic view of objectivity as defined by what an object is in logic, and the premise that the world works this way that logic works for, I don't know, 25 years, because it's a view of logic I got in, college from my logic professors and all the philosophy professors. It's what logic is. Even an anarchist that disagrees that logic applies to everything has an agreement on what that logic is, and when they criticize it, they're criticizing something with terms that are understood in common, right? So I've been arguing about that. You can see in my thousands of videos that there's many videos going back on this subject. And you come along and are arguing with me. I'm wrong and appear to be defending classical logic. So we dig down deeper into it and find out that your view of what an object is and what a property is not the view of classical logic. It's more similar to my view. And you don't seem to know some of the ramifications of that if properties are relationships, then that means you have these infinite number of unascertainable property of relationships. This gets in the way of things like the law of the excluded middle, that that an object either is classifiable in set A or isn't, because by some relationships it'll be classifiable as A, and in some it won't, and there's always more relationships to discover, so we'll never have this exclusion. And they actually use this to prove things. When I was first taking logic, I loved it, and I still love logic. I think it's awesome. I love math. Knowing that math as it applies to reality as certain issues is a part of loving math to me. And it's the same with logic, but there were some shocking things when I finally, they were describing a conditional, if then, and it's weird, I mean, if the moon is made of cheese, then it would taste like cheese, is true. But so is, if the moon is made of cheese, it would taste like chocolate. That's also true, because in the logical conditional, if the antecedent is false, the conditional is true. Because why? Because they don't want to have to go out and be empirical to establish a synthetic truth of a relationship between what kind of thing something is and, say, its flavor or some other property. If they have to do that, they have to go out into the world and check. So the whole idea of logic is based on this thing in itself, that just looking at a thing and nothing else, you can classify it. You want to say that's true because all of its relationships are really in itself. You don't have to look at another thing to know what its relationship is to the first thing. Of course, that wouldn't make sense. And there are probably some disagreements that go along that line, but we're stuck at this point where you, and for those that don't know, Maslux had said that I was trying to force an idea on him just to criticize it. Because I'm telling him what, classical logic says a thing and its properties are like. But I'm criticizing it. But see, the fact that I'm criticizing it should make it clear I'm not arguing from authority that you have to agree with Bertrand Russell, because I don't. But we can still agree on what the classical system is, how it's taught, how it's used, and things like that. But we're at a semantic area. I have given a description of a relativistic, an interpretation of relativism that I think solves a lot of these problems. And I have no doubt that if you modified classical logic into a relativistic logic, many of the tools would survive that transition. And mostly our analysis and our conception of what we know would change, and our faith in a priori truths would change. But you seem petulant. Probably, I would think the reason would have to be because you didn't like finding out that your use of object and properties isn't the classical one, and you would like to be in the position of authority defending traditional logic. And it's probably awkward if somebody that's criticizing traditional logic is also having to educate you on what traditional logic is. But you should just get over that and move on to finding some qualifiers for your terms. So, you know, a relativistic property or something, if you want to reuse those terms, or even take the plunge and realize that we have other terms to talk about these things, and to maybe realize what the ramification is on a lot of classical thinking due to the modifications both you and I have made. You know, you can't criticize me for being overt and saying, hey, I have a different idea than this classical logic one, when you also have a different idea but just haven't said it and are using all the classical definitions, and as if, what, are you trying to fool us or yourself, or you just didn't know that when you were trying to figure out what it could possibly mean and fit it into your understanding of the world, that you modified it from what it means in classical logic. And I don't think it's right to criticize me when I'm being overt, unless you want to specifically argue that us changing conceptions in logic should, for some reason, be done covertly. And that's not what you're saying. So quite the opposite. You seem to be projecting and acting like I'm being sneaky and I'm being covert, and I'm all my cards are on the table. So cheers.